Good morning, everybody. This week we are all about the American Revolution. And we're not going to talk too much today about individual battles because you can read about those in any textbook or any, sort of encyclopedia about the American Revolution. What I am going to do is discuss the ideas behind the revolution and their consequences. And we'll talk about some of the most important debates that historians have about the American Revolution. So, the first question that I want to pose to you is this question: what is a revolution? And did we have one here in 1776? So we need to ask this question: how revolutionary was the American Revolution? And to do that, we need to define what we mean by a revolution and figure out how well the American Revolution fits that definition. So Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines a revolution as a fundamental change in political organization, especially the overthrow or renunciation of one government or ruler and the substitution of another by the governed. So if we think of a revolution along those lines, do you think the American Revolution fits that definition? And why or why not? But there's more to the definition. A revolution, according to the dictionary, is also activity or movement designed to effect fundamental changes in the socioeconomic situation. What does that mean? If we accept this as the definition of a revolution, does the American Revolution fit into this definition? And why or why not? But wait, there's still more. A revolution is also a fundamental change in the way of thinking about or visualizing something, a change in paradigm. So if this is also a revolution, then does the American Revolution fit the bill? Why or why not? Now, of course, the common thread, if you look at the wording of these definitions, is the fact that a revolution seems to require a fundamental change. Do you think the American Revolution represented a fundamental change? So if we look at the traditional narrative that often gets told about the American Revolution, it seems pretty obvious that the American Revolution fits that first definition, a revolution as a fundamental change in political organization, pretty neatly. The story that most often gets told about the American Revolution is that the British were ruling over the colonies tyrannically. So American colonists fought the British for their independence, and they prevailed, and they established a new nation with a new form of government that was supposed to guarantee liberty and justice for all. That's what we all learned in elementary school, right? Today, I want to focus on looking at the American Revolution a little differently. I want to concentrate more on the second and third definitions of revolution as our guidelines. What happens when we consider the socioeconomic aspects of the revolution, or the impact of revolutionary ideals upon the ways of thinking of ordinary people? So I'm first going to talk about how the colonists come to view themselves as a distinct people, separate from Britain. In order to break away from England, the colonists had to first begin to forge a new American identity. And before they can talk about creating a new nation, residents from all the different and distinct colonies have to come to believe that they have a common purpose. They have to stop seeing themselves primarily as Virginians or Pennsylvanians or New Yorkers or South Carolinians and start seeing themselves as Americans. Now, this wasn't easy. If you had a time machine and you were to go back in time to 1760, just 15 years before the first shots of the American Revolution were fired at Lexington and Concord, and asked any colonist whether they wanted to be independent from Britain, chances are pretty good that they would reply, absolutely not. If you told them that in just 15 years the colonies would be fighting against the British for their independence, they probably wouldn't believe you. If you asked them to identify themselves or tell you what country they were from, they would probably respond, I'm an Englishman, or maybe I'm a Virginian, or I'm from Massachusetts. So, in just a very short period of time, all of this begins to change. The colonists start to see themselves as a separate people, separate from the English. And they also start to see themselves as a unified people, as Americans, though this process took much, much longer. How does this happen? So this is a cartoon. You may have seen it before. It's a cartoon drawn by Benjamin Franklin. And knowing nothing more about this cartoon, what would you say it's about? If you had to pinpoint a date for when it was created, when would you estimate that it was created? Well, it might be a little surprised to learn that this cartoon was actually drawn in 1754, right as the 7 Years' War was breaking out, which I talked about last time. The British and colonial leaders at the time were trying to figure out what their policy toward Native Americans should be in regard to this coming war with France. And they were planning to hold a conference in Albany, New York, where they would sit down with representatives from major Indian nations, including the very powerful Iroquois nation, to work out their relationship. For several years, Ben Franklin had been advocating for this kind of thing. He called it a plan of union, which would place Indian affairs under the control of a legislature comprising of delegates from all the colonies and a governor general appointed by the crown for all North America. Basically, he was saying to the British and the colonial leaders, look, we better get our act together when it comes to the Indians because we are going to need their help against the French. He was really worried when the French established Fort Duquesne. And so before the Albany Congress convened, he published this cartoon in his newspaper, arguing that the colonies needed to unite together to take military action against the French at Fort Duquesne. He convinced the delegates at the Albany Conference that they should consider this idea of a plan of union. The Albany Congress debated the plan. They worked out a text that the delegates could take back to their various colonial assemblies. The colonial assemblies, however, rejected this idea. Some just ignored it. Others voted it down because the assembly was unwilling to give up power to a continent-wide legislative body, even one that was only very limited in scope. Virginia doesn't even send a delegation to the Albany Congress, and they never even considered the plan at all. So this tells us that in 1754, just a few years before the conflicts that led to the Revolutionary War begin to emerge, the colonies are divided. They are fractured. They are not willing to come together as a single body. It doesn't seem very likely at this point that they would unite to throw off their colonial ruler if they can't even get together to agree on a unified policy for Native Americans. But the 7 Years' War changes things dramatically. As I mentioned last time, there are some things to, sort of know here. There are some terms to know. We talked last time about colonial newspapers and how they were modeled off of the newspapers in England, and they often contained reprinted British articles. And because of this, colonists were able to keep updated on what's going on back in England, and there was a lot of political turmoil happening. There's this battle between the Tories and the Whigs, the Tories being the royalists, who argue that the king is supreme over Parliament, and the Whigs being those who argue for the supremacy of Parliament over the king. The colonists are reading about all this in their newspapers, and they find all this very disturbing. And in addition to the political crisis going on in England, because of the 7 Years' War, the British are also faced with an economic crisis. They have borrowed a lot of money to finance the war. And in addition, now that they have this vast amount of territory that they've won from the French in the war, they have to keep around 10,000 British troops in North America to keep Native Americans from rising up against them and to stifle discontent among the French and Spanish populations that are now part of this British Empire. The cost of maintaining these troops added to the debt from the war, and when they tried to raise taxes back at home, this led to a lot of unrest. So in 1763, a man named George Grenville becomes the Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is a fancy term for the chief finance minister to King George III. He comes into this office inheriting a national debt of around 145 million pounds. And he decided, in order to raise revenue and reduce the debt, that he's going to begin to implement some new taxes in the American colonies. Essentially, he's asking the colonists to bear a share of the costs of running the British Empire. So in 1764, Parliament passes the Sugar Act, and then in the following year, they pass the Stamp Act. These acts place duties on sugar imported into the colonies and also required that all printed materials, newspapers, legal documents, even things like dice and playing cards had to be given a special stamp, and you had to buy that stamp in order to purchase those goods. Many colonists, particularly merchants, professional people, lawyers, printers, other influential members of colonial society, are not very happy about these new taxes. Colonial male property owners, a small proportion of the entire colonial population, we have to keep in mind, elected their own assemblies, but they can't vote in British elections, which meant that the colonists don't have any direct representative in Parliament advocating for their interests. Now, this was not particularly unusual. In fact, most people in England didn't have direct representation in Parliament. Only a very small percentage of the English population actually got to vote for their representatives. The British government argued that Americans were subject to Parliament by virtual representation. Colonists had been reading the writings of the Whigs in Britain, who wanted a more democratic system of government, and they began to argue that if they were going to be taxed, they should have actual representation. So hence we get the popular slogan, "No taxation without representation." So when we look at the socioeconomic aspects of the American Revolution, it begins to look less like a political conflict between the American colonists and the British, and more like an internal social and economic conflict within the colonies themselves. We have to remember that the American colonies were a pretty diverse society, one of the most diverse societies in the world at that time, in fact. You had people from Europe, many of English heritage, yes, but settlers from Germany, the Netherlands, France, Ireland, other countries as well, commingling with people of African heritage brought here forcibly as an enslaved population. You have the various indigenous peoples, the diverse Native American tribes. So ethnically, this is a very heterogeneous population. The colonies were socially and economically diverse as well. Of course, you have a small number who are very, very wealthy, part of what was known as the gentry, mostly southern planters, northern merchants, professional people like lawyers, doctors, ministers. You have a small but growing middle class, shopkeepers, skilled artisans, and you have the vast majority of colonists who are pretty poor, small farmers, eking out a living on the frontier, apprentices and journeymen learning their trades in the cities, ship workers and sailors up and down the coasts, servants and itinerant laborers, and of course, enslaved people who were the very bottom of the social and economic hierarchy. Colonial society was therefore deeply divided in terms of class, and these divisions are growing in the years preceding the Revolution. Why is this important? Well, if we delve into a story about the Stamp Act, it can illustrate how the socioeconomic divisions in American colonial society are relevant for our discussion of the Revolution. So on the morning of August 14th, 1765, the people of Boston wake up to find there is an effigy of a man named Andrew Oliver, a well-to-do colonial government official, hanging from a tree in Boston Common. And pinned to the dummy was a paper with a short poem on it. The poem read, "A goodlier sight who e'er did see, a stamp man hanging on a tree." So remember, Parliament had recently passed the Stamp Act, and Thomas Hutchinson, the lieutenant governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, had appointed Andrew Oliver, his brother-in-law, as the distributor of the stamps for the colony. Now, it seems pretty obvious that whoever made this effigy of Oliver was angry because of this new tax that the colonists were going to have to pay on any sort of printed material. At issue was the question of whether Parliament had the right to tax the colonies in order to raise money, when the colonies had no official representative in Parliament. But why target Oliver, and by extension, the Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson specifically? Well, the ordinary people of Boston knew that Oliver and Hutchinson were part of the colonial elite. They are among the most powerful and influential men in the colony. And the town meeting, and they also knew that just a few years before, in 1763, Hutchinson had tried to abolish the town meeting in Boston. And the town meeting is, of course, a cherished institution among ordinary people. It was one of the only opportunities for self-government that ordinary Bostonians had. Hutchinson and his cronies were essentially making a grab for more power. And as a result, middle and lower class residents of Boston had lost a lot of faith and trust in their leaders. Boston was a town deeply divided by class, in other words, and this sets up a potentially explosive situation on the morning of August 14th, 1765. So Hutchinson finds out about this protest. He orders the local sheriff to cut down the effigy, but a crowd assembles around it to stop him. And by the end of the day, a bunch of working men gather for a mock funeral. They're led by a man named Ebenezer McIntosh, a poor shoemaker. He's something of a leader within the working class community in Boston. The crowd cuts Oliver's effigy down and parades it through the streets toward the townhouse, the center of government. Then they head over to Oliver's stamp distribution office down at the wharf, and they essentially ransack the building. They take the timbers from the stamp office and they build a bonfire with them outside Oliver's luxurious home. They behead the effigy and they destroy Oliver's stable and his horse-drawn coach, symbols of his affluence and prominence in the community. For 4 hours, the crowd rampages through Oliver's house, breaking windows, demolishing all of his elegant furniture, drinking the contents of his well-stocked wine cellar, trampling through his stately gardens. The next morning, Oliver, probably not surprisingly, asks to be relieved of his duties as stamp distributor. 12 days later, another similar mob does the same thing to Hutchinson's mansion. What does this story tell us? Well, it should clue us in that there is a lot of anger in Boston, and it's not just due to the Stamp Act. After all, if that's all the colonists were upset about, why go on, after destroying the stamp office, why go on to destroy Oliver and Hutchinson's houses and property? The fact that the crowd targeted the overt symbols of the wealth and power of the elite suggests that ordinary Bostonians were deeply angry at the inequality they saw before them. They felt that some of their fellow citizens were getting rich while they were suffering economic hardship, and they resented this situation as being unfair. Political protest, anger at British policies, gets mixed up with economic protest, anger at class inequalities. The crowd in Boston, which is mainly made up of working class people, is attempting literally to level the economic playing field. News about the mob attacks in Boston spreads throughout the other colonies pretty quickly, and similar protests break out in other colonial towns. People who had never voted before because they weren't allowed to vote, as they didn't hold property, or who had never played any kind of public role, begin to take to the streets to resist British policy. The really radical aspect of this, though, was that these protests against the Stamp Act in some places became protests against economic inequality and the colonial class system. So if we think about that second definition of revolution there, this is pretty revolutionary stuff. And this is long before Lexington and Concord. One tool that the colonists in the cities used to oppose the British and unite their fellow citizens behind the cause of no taxation without representation was the broadside. A broadside was a large piece of paper printed only on one side. It was essentially a poster designed to convey news or information, and broadsides were posted and distributed all over the urban centers of the colonies. Sometimes they were also read aloud in public, so they had this wide-ranging impact. We can kind of maybe think of them as like the Twitter, or as you want to, if you want to call it X, I don't know. It's a way for people to very quickly share news and commentary about what's going on in the world. This particular broadside is significant because it refers to the boycott movement that became a crucial part of colonial opposition to the British tax policies. This particular broadside that I've posted here announces that a man named William Jackson, a local merchant, is continuing to import British goods, and the citizens of Boston should not patronize his shops. One interesting thing that is intriguing about this document is that it mentions, if you look at the bottom paragraph there, it mentions both the sons and daughters of liberty. Women were very crucial to the boycott movement. They are often the ones doing the shopping for colonial households, so they have economic power at their disposal and they use it. Probably no picture was more influential as a cause of the American Revolution than this one. It's also by Paul Revere, and it's a masterful piece of propaganda. But what is it depicting and what's the real story behind it? First, a little bit of background. So in order to squash all of this brewing discontent in the colonies, the British stationed troops in many of the large cities like Boston and New York. And as often happens with an occupying army, these troops were not very popular with the citizens. There were often conflicts between troops and the townspeople. And one of the reasons for this conflict was economic. Troops were allowed, when they were off duty, to have outside jobs. And so they were competing with the townspeople for work. So in Boston, a soldier goes looking for work in early March of 1770 in a rope-making shop. The townspeople working there basically told him rather rudely that, yeah, you can have a job and go clean that outhouse over there. The soldier later returned with some of his friends. A small riot breaks out. Fighting between the soldiers and the workers continues over the next couple of days. Then on the evening of March 5th, 1770, a crowd of workers gathers at the customs house, where a lot of the hated taxes were collected. And they begin taunting the lone British guard stationed outside. So he's afraid for his life. He calls for backup. A group of 7 or 8 soldiers comes to his aid. They're facing this crowd that begins pelting them with snowballs and stones. Many in the crowd were rope makers, and they carried the heavy clubs that are used for making rope. Suddenly, without orders, the frightened soldiers begin to fire upon the crowd. 3 were killed instantly. 6 more were wounded. 2 would later die from their wounds. The first to be killed was actually a young man named Crispus Attucks, who was half Native American and half African American. When the soldiers escaped back to their barracks, a crowd of hundreds rampaged through the streets demanding vengeance. This incident quickly becomes known as the Boston Massacre, and it's largely through this print by Paul Revere that it becomes so infamous. So I think this is a really interesting historical document for a lot of reasons, but we want to think about, well, why is he entitling this picture The Bloody Massacre? What does this title and the use of the word massacre imply? How does Revere portray this incident? Is his portrayal an accurate one? And why or why not? And how might you have responded if you lived in the American colonies and you saw this image in a newspaper or in a broadside? These are, so some very inflammatory accusations that Revere is leveling here. And I think it's worth thinking about, sort of what this did for the patriot cause. Because of the violent protests against the Stamp Act, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act the following year in 1766, but the problems plaguing colonial society don't go away. The legacy of the Stamp Act protests was that the political consciousness of ordinary colonists had been raised, and people saw how effective their actions could be. In 1772, a major London bank collapses, and this touches off a credit crisis. Up until this point, American merchants had been freely importing British goods on credit given to them by English merchants. Colonial merchants then extended credit to retailers, who then in turn gave credit to consumers. When English creditors, after this bank collapses, they begin to call into their debts. Colonial merchants then have to pay those debts back. They're suffering. They have to declare bankruptcy themselves, or they have to force the shopkeepers to pay their debts back. Shopkeepers then demanded their consumers settle their accounts. So it's a spiraling economic crisis. Urban poverty really begins to grow rapidly in the 1770s. And this made colonists, particularly those in the middle class, very anxious. It seems like the economic system is in danger of crumbling, and it becomes increasingly obvious that honest dealings, thriftiness is not necessarily going to lead to wealth. So when the British begin imposing tax after new tax, colonists felt they were justified in their anger against the empire. Economic difficulties and this growing crisis with England produces a lot of resentment against wealth, challenges to elite power, and a coalescing of artisan and working class interests, particularly in the cities along the coast. As one New York newspaper puts it, is it equitable that 99 rather 999 should suffer for the extravagance or grandeur of one, especially when it is considered that men frequently owe their wealth to the impoverishment of their neighbors? So one of the main ways that middle and upper class patriot leaders harnessed the power of ordinary colonists was through the boycott of British goods. In 1774, the First Continental Congress called for the creation of revolutionary committees throughout the colonies to enforce the boycott. An estimated about 7,000 men were elected to these committees, and many of these men were serving now in a public position for the very first time in their lives. These men controlled the colony's economic life, and the committees become these centers of political power. They used this power not only to enforce the boycott of British goods, but also to bring the colonies closer to declaring independence and to bring about democratic reforms. A lot of this is happening in small towns in western Massachusetts, where colonists begin to dismantle local government and defy the crown in the summer of 1774. In Worcester, for example, wealthy councilmen who had been appointed by the royal governor were forced by local farmers and townspeople to publicly humiliate themselves and resign from their posts. Ordinary citizens in small towns close the courts. They begin to govern themselves by holding weekly town meetings, even though these meetings are declared illegal by the governor. When the governor calls in 80 British troops to the town of Salem to arrest members of the local committee of correspondence, 3,000 armed men met them, and the governor had to back down. The radicalism of these Western farmers pushed the colony of Massachusetts to the brink of war, and similar scenarios are happening throughout all the colonies. Ordinary citizens rejecting their government and installing their own government. They're taking the power into their own hands. Economics and politics are being intimately wed together in these protests. In Philadelphia, for example, militiamen begin to come together in 1775, calling themselves associators. And they have an agenda of reform that goes beyond simply resisting the British. One, calling himself tradesman, wrote in one of the local newspapers arguing that our great merchants, making immense fortunes at the expense of the people, will soon have the whole wealth of the province in their hands. And he said that once these men were overthrown, all ranks and conditions would come in for their just share of the wealth. The associators organized their own committee of correspondence and demanded political rights. So these ideas are spreading very rapidly throughout the colonies. Pamphlets were another important way that the colonists come to develop a sense of identity and common purpose. Much of the argument for revolution and independence was made in pamphlets which were printed by the thousands and circulated throughout the colonies. Probably no piece of written material was more influential in providing Americans with the justification for revolution than Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in 1776. Paine's pamphlet really helps to move the colonists away from merely being angry at British policies to calling for revolution and independence. This is not an easy transition to make. Even though the first shots of the American Revolution had already been fired by the spring and summer of 1775, many colonists are still reluctant at this point to cut all ties with Britain. Even the leaders of the rebellion, gathered at the Second Continental Congress in the spring and summer of 1775, were still acting pretty cautiously. They opposed what Parliament had been doing. So the Second Continental Congress in the spring and summer of 1775 were still acting pretty cautiously. They opposed what Parliament had been doing, passing all those taxes, sending troops to harass the colonists, dissolving colonial legislatures, but they still held some fond feelings for the British king. On July 5th, 1775, the Second Continental Congress passed what was known as the Olive Branch Petition, which professed a continuing attachment to King George and begged him to prevent further hostilities. They're basically saying to the king, look, we don't like what Parliament and your officials have been doing, but we still love you. We don't want to be independent, so please use your power to end all this fighting and take care of us again. After the Battle of Bunker Hill in August of 1775, where, although they ultimately won the battle, the British suffered very heavy casualties, King George was having none of it. He rejected the Olive Branch Petition and he declared the colonies to be in open and avowed rebellion. So even as late as the summer of 1775, a lot of the colonists weren't really advocating for independence. Then Thomas Paine's book comes out, and it helps to finally sever those remaining emotional bonds between the colonists and Britain. Common Sense sold more than 100,000 copies within a few months. It goes through 25 editions in 1776. Eventually, it sells more copies than any printed piece in colonial history. Paine wrote for the common people. He used a lot of biblical imagery that most colonists would be very familiar with, and he used very plain language. He avoided the elaborate legalistic style of most other pamphlets of the time. He argued that the British system of government rested on what he called two ancient tyrannies, aristocracy and monarchy, and that neither were appropriate for America. He placed the blame for the oppression of the colonists squarely upon King George III, and he told colonists that we have it in our power to begin the world over again. These were really inspiring words, and they made many colonists believe that they could get rid of British control, start over with a clean slate, and make a new country. The point of these stories I've been telling is that even before the Continental Congress declares independence in 1776 and begins the work of establishing a government to unite the 13 colonies, ordinary colonists had been establishing their own quasi-governments on a local level to address internal problems, particularly economic inequality. This process of taking the reins of government into their own hands was revolution in itself, because it meant that ordinary people now saw themselves as having the power to change things, to become agents of history. And that brings us to our third definition of revolution, a fundamental change in the way of thinking. Not only are colonists coming to think of themselves as a distinct people, they're not British any longer, now they have this new identity as Americans, but they're also beginning to view themselves as having the power to shape their new nation and the world. Thomas Paine said, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again. The birthday of a new world is at hand." As we will see, the ideas put forward in the Declaration of Independence, specifically liberty and equality, are flowing freely throughout the colonists. And different individuals have different ideas how those ideas should be realized. So to recap what I've sort of talked about so far, between 1763 and 1775, many colonists begin to see themselves as no longer English. Now they see themselves as American. Revolutionary ideas spread throughout the postal service, throughout newspapers, broadsides, pamphlets, propaganda. These unite the colonists under a common purpose. And through all this printed material, many colonists begin to develop their own political ideology, borrowed partly from the English Whig writers, partly from theories of the Enlightenment, partly from their own experiences. Historians have called this new ideology revolutionary republicanism. I talked about republicanism in my last lecture. Does anyone remember what this idea involved? How would you summarize the 18th century idea of republicanism? Well, it's this civic and patriotic ideal in which the personal sort of individual citizens citizenship gets founded in property, that government is both the principal source of corruption, and also the promoting of, sort of the idea that, sort of government can be, kind of composed of these virtuous citizens. And American revolutionaries are taking a lesson here from ancient Rome. They're determined to avoid the luxurious lifestyles, the greed that had destroyed the Roman Empire. A virtuous citizen is defined as someone who ignored monetary compensation and made this commitment to resist and eradicate corruption. Republicanism required the service of those who were willing to give up their own interests for a common good. One historian puts it this way. He said, the preservation of liberty rested on the ability of people to maintain effective checks on the wielders of power. And so the duty of a virtuous citizen became a foundation for the ideology of the American Revolution. Now we're going to look primarily at this third definition of revolution, the fundamental change in the way of thinking about or visualizing something, a change of paradigm. We'll be examining how the revolution changed the way that people, particularly people from marginalized groups in society, changed the way they thought. So I've titled today's lecture, The World Turned Upside Down, which is intentionally a reference to one of the songs from the Broadway musical Hamilton. The song in Hamilton is itself a reference to an English song first published in the 1640s. And there's an apocryphal tale that after the British surrendered at Yorktown in 1781, the English army band played the song "The World Turned Upside Down" as the British marched out of the fort. And in the musical Hamilton, Lin-Manuel Miranda references this story, which may or may not be true, in one of the lyrics to the song. He says, "We negotiate the terms of surrender. I see George Washington smile. We escort their men out of Yorktown. They stagger home, single file. Tens of thousands of people flood the streets. There are screams and church bells ringing. And as our fallen foes retreat, I hear the drinking song they're singing. The world turned upside down." Now think about this for a minute. What must that moment have been like? The revolution changed the life of virtually every American, for better or for worse. For the first time in the history of the modern world, a group of people had decided that they wanted to be independent from their ruling power. They had fought a war against that power, and eventually they won. And not only that, but the ideals that the Americans fought for were unprecedented. The right of a people to determine their own rule and destiny. The idea that all people were created equal. This really was the world turned upside down. Everything that had defined society in Europe, the monarchy, the divine right of kings, the social hierarchy that said some people were on the top and some were on the bottom and that could never be changed. All of this had been thrown into question by the American Revolution. I'm going to talk a little bit about the people who actually fought in the Revolution. Probably one of the most enduring symbols of the American Revolution is the Minuteman, the citizen soldier. It's a pretty powerful image even at the time of the revolution. John Adams wrote in 1776 that we must all be soldiers pro aries et faucis, for God and country. The idea that men from all walks of life came together to fight for their independence, their homes, their communities. It's a really attractive idea. It's one of the things that still draws people to become interested in the American Revolution today. But what is that the real story? Who really fought in the American Revolution, and why did they fight? What was their experience like during the Revolution? Certainly in the first year or so of the conflict, revolutionary fervor ran very high and people were very eager to fight. But by the end of 1776, the character of the Continental Army had changed. As the war dragged on, fewer and fewer people were interested in actually fighting. For most of the war, the majority of the men who fought under General Washington were very different from this celebrated myth of the Minuteman. They were overwhelmingly from the lower classes, and they mainly enlisted so that the mythical citizen soldier could avoid military service. State militias, in which men from all walks of life served short terms, did fight in the Revolution, but the war could not be won without a regular standing army. Most of the men who served in the 38 regular regiments during the war were poor. Many were fresh off the boat immigrants from Ireland or from Germany, convicts, or men desperate for anything that might be able to earn them a little bit of money. Most were very, very young, very poor. They didn't have strong community attachments. They didn't really have much to lose. So why did they fight? It wasn't necessarily because they were fervently opposed to the British or filled with patriotic spirit. Many saw fighting in the war as a chance to better themselves, and they were attracted because those who wanted to avoid military service could pay a bounty. And if you had enough money, you could pay a poor man to fight in your stead. And without these men, the war would likely have ended very quickly with a British victory. One private described the conditions that soldiers faced. He said, the army was now not only starved, but naked. The greatest part were not only shirtless and barefoot, but destitute of all other clothing, especially blankets. I procured a small piece of raw cowhide and made myself a pair of moccasins, which kept my feet, while they lasted, from the frozen ground. So these men came from very humble origins, but they had heard the message of the revolution, and they were deeply invested in their rights as colonial soldiers, continental soldiers for the Continental Army. They struggled to make their voices heard. They demanded that they be paid their wages. They demanded that they be supplied with adequate food and clothing. Desertion was a constant problem, but many chose to stick it out and demand that they be given what they were due. And often the only way that soldiers saw to assert their rights was to mutiny. By 1780, Private Joseph Martin's unit was near its breaking point. He said the men were exasperated beyond endurance. They saw no other alternative but to starve to death or break up the army, give all up, and go home. And conditions like this were similar throughout the Continental Army. The first large-scale mutiny finally breaks out in January of 1781. The men of Pennsylvania and New Jersey rebelled against their officers in the name of some of the most basic goals of the revolution: social justice, equality, fair play. And many of the officers, and even General Washington himself, believed that their men were justified. On January 1st, 1781, the 3-year terms of many of the soldiers were supposed to expire, and most of them were willing to re-enlist if they were given a new bounty. But their officers told them that Congress meant that their enlistment extended for the duration of the war. The men insisted that they had enlisted for 3 years or the duration of the war, whichever came first. And so on the morning of January 1st, the enlisted men rebelled and they took control of their camp. Some officers were killed. Many others were wounded, and the following day they began marching towards Philadelphia. They intended to meet face to face with Congress to see themselves righted. So now nearly a quarter of Washington's army is in full-scale rebellion. Washington, upon hearing the news of this, he doesn't have a lot of good options. He directed one of his generals to listen to the men's grievances. He promised that their complaints would be carefully considered. He actually agreed with the mutineers. He had been desperately trying to get Congress to help the army for months. And the general met with the men and agreed to their main demands. So here we have the men who were fighting for America's independence, using revolutionary ideals to demand justice and fair treatment. Great example of how ordinary Americans took matters into their own hands during the Revolution and attempted to make good on the promises of the Revolution. During the Revolution, it's not just soldiers who are doing this. It's also civilians. Protesting what they see as the unfair economic practices of their fellow citizens. Just a few days after the Continental Congress declared independence from England, a couple of merchants in Connecticut, Samuel Colton and a married couple, Jonathan and Hezekiah Hale, they became the target of their neighbors' anger when they started to jack up the prices on basic things like molasses and sugar and salt. The citizens of the town of Longmeadow, Connecticut, sent a letter and warned them that every man whose actions are unfriendly to the common cause of our country, and I think it's notable that they're already referring to our country, ought to be convinced of his wrong behavior and made to reform or treated as an open enemy. And they said to Colton and the Hales, "We find you guilty of very wrong behavior in selling at extravagant prices. This conduct is very detrimental to the liberties of America. We therefore, your offended brethren, demand satisfaction of you." The Hales relented and they agreed to cut back their prices. But Colton, who happened to be the wealthiest man in town, he resisted. That night, a group of townspeople broke into his store. They liberated his supplies and gave them to the town clerk to be sold at a fairer price. The clerk then tried to give Colton the proceeds of the sale, but when he refused to accept the money, the leaders of the mob entered his house, put the money on a table, and left. And I think this is a really interesting story because one of the things that it tells us is that Americans were still divided over class and economics. On the one side, you have people like Samuel Colton who are deeply invested in their property and in gaining wealth for themselves. On the other side, you have the citizens of Longmeadow who argued that private profit should not trump the welfare of the community. America is making this gradual transition toward a capitalistic economy, but this transition is contested in a lot of places. Prosperous farmers, shopkeepers, merchants, they've embraced the idea of a market economy, but the lower classes aren't so sure that having an unregulated free market is a good thing. The movement toward independence had been fueled by anger at British economic policies that had seemed to be unfair to colonists at all levels of society. So withdrawing from the British-controlled market was as much a part of claiming independence as setting up a new government. But this meant that Americans were in a difficult position because they can no longer rely on British goods. They have to either produce their own or do without. And a lot of colonists believed that the war required common sacrifices from everybody. Manipulating the market for your own personal gain, jacking up the prices, putting your profit ahead of the community welfare, taking advantage of people. This is as bad as swearing allegiance to the crown. So fair dealing and patriotism become synonymous. As the war goes on into 1777, 78, 79, the economy is not going great. The colonists experienced severe economic hardship. Commodities were scarce. Inflation is running rampant. Some of the colonists are attempting to profit from the war. The Continental Congress had no authority to tax the colonies to pay for the war, so it starts issuing huge amounts of paper money that pretty quickly becomes worthless. For ordinary people, this meant that prices are going through the roof. The question was, how far were states willing to go to issue price controls? Farmers, merchants, they want to get the best price for their goods, but consumers are demanding that prices be just. And so in Pennsylvania, the great example of this, the state legislature could not agree on putting price controls on prices, and that kind of left consumers in the lurch. The situation grew worse and worse as the British grew closer and closer to capturing the city of Philadelphia. In one Philadelphia newspaper, a writer warned the city's merchants. He said, "Hear this and tremble, ye enemies, to freedom and happiness of your country. We cannot live without bread. Hunger will break through stone walls, and the resentment excited by it may end in your destruction." Pretty soon, things grew even worse. The flour merchants of the city, knowing that the French fleet is on its way, they end up refusing to sell for paper currency. And this is the only money that most of the ordinary families in the city had. So almost overnight, you can't buy a loaf of bread anywhere. Residents of Philadelphia come together and they formed a committee of trade, trying to kind of fix prices and get merchants and retailers to comply with them and give bread and flour and other staples like that to the poor. The merchants, however, they realize this committee doesn't really have any legal authority, so they're refusing to sell their goods at these controlled prices. So we have kind of two sides of this unrestricted market economy, and supporters of what people began to call a moral economy are kind of facing off against each other. And in the fall of 1779, a group of local militiamen had had enough. They kidnapped 4 city merchants and they paraded them around the city in this kind of ritual humiliation. And then they head for the house of James Wilson, who was a leading attorney in the city, and he was a fervent opponent of price controls. Wilson barricades himself in the house with several of his merchant friends. All of them are armed to the teeth. As the militiamen march the unlucky merchants in front of the house, shots ring out. No one knows who fired first. The militiamen then bring a cannon in front of the house, and they try to break down the doors. Wilson and his friends are firing on the crowd from inside the house, and it ended up that 5 people were killed and 14 people were wounded in what became known as the Fort Wilson riot. And this is happening just blocks away from where the Continental Congress met. So actions like these, stories taken by the citizens of Longmeadow and Philadelphia, this is really central to how ordinary people understood the political and economic issues of the Revolution. Ordinary people, again, taking the law into their own hands to feed their families and uphold this idea of a moral economy. This argument over whether the good of the community takes precedence over individual profit is really intimately connected to ideas of why the colonists are fighting the Revolution. And we are still, to some degree, debating these issues today. All right, let me just... So to kind of sum up, we've explored the meaning of the American Revolution, both for diverse groups of Americans who experienced it firsthand, and a little bit, thinking about it for us living in the United States over 200 years later. What do I want you to take away from this? I want you to take away a couple of things. First, the ideals of the Revolution, liberty and equality, specifically, these are not just words thrown about by the Founding Fathers. They're ideas that ordinary Americans take to heart and hear, and they interpret in their own ways. Americans give meaning to those ideals through their actions and their attempts to change the world. And we're going to talk more about this later this week. However, this was an unfinished revolution. Not all those ideals of liberty and equality are fully realized for everyone in American society. They're there as a foundation, though, and it's going to be up to later generations to try to transform the nation to realize the promise of those ideals. Expectations get raised that are not completely satisfied. But one of the really powerful things that the revolution does do is that it gives ordinary Americans the sense that they could change their society, they could change history, and they don't have to defer to powerful people or interests any longer. So that is kind of my spiel about the American Revolution. And before coming to class, for those of you in my on-site class, before coming to class on October 9th, make sure that you've read chapter 5 in the American Yawp and done the reading quiz. And then also make sure that you've read through chapter 5 in Going to the Source. Chapter 5 talks about songs in revolutionary America and how we can use songs as primary sources to understand more about the revolution and the ideals that people were fighting for. So that's what we're going to be doing on Wednesday. And then for those of you in the online class, you'll be looking at some of the other sources for your discussion this week. And as always, if you have any questions, please do get in touch with me either after class or post in the discussion forum or send me an email. And I'm happy to help in any way I can. Okay, take care, everybody. Bye for now.